option is a little bit more complicated, but it allows a lot of our growers in Colorado to be part of this exemption. So farmers that have total food sales of less than $500,000 and they sell directly to the consumer, and those consumers are in Colorado or within 275 miles of their farm. So the 275 miles is important for our farmers who are on the borders of our state and have the opportunity to sell into other states. So as long as you're selling within 275 miles of your farm, you can sell into another state. And then just keep in mind that that consumer can buy produce through a farm stand, through CSA or online sales. It can also be considered a restaurant or a retail store as well. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So if you guys need more, sorry about that, sorry for the technical difficulties as we work through this. If you need more information about the produce safety rule, please go to our website. It's www.coproducesafety.org. Or you can contact myself, Christy Dice, Martha Sullins, or Danielle Dunai, and our contact information is listed there on the slide. And we'll show this again at the end as well. Next slide, please. So as Martha mentioned, today we're going to talk to you about the guidance document that was released from FDA in October of 2018. It's called the Standards for Growing, Harvesting, Packing, and Holding of Produce for Human Consumption Draft Guidance for the Industry. And if you want to follow along, if you wanted to access the document, you can click on the link that's there on the right-hand side of the slide, and that will take you to the page that has the guidance document that you can download. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what is guidance. It's kind of an odd word to use, I think, but this is what a common language that's used by FDA. And we like to think of it as FDA's current thinking on the produce safety rule. So they put the language of the rule out, and then afterwards they periodically put information out called guidance. And this is the information that farmers can use to figure out what the interpretation of the rule is. And it's really helpful for farmers because it has a lot of different examples of farming practices and information on how farmers can comply with the rule. It has evolved from many different areas and many different places. So as many of you probably have heard previously, there's the Technical Assistance Network that farmers and anybody really can submit questions to, and that's a federal website where people can go and submit questions. So they use some information from there. They reviewed scientific literature, comments and responses from the preamble of the produce safety rule, and then resources from other institutions. So all of that information gets gathered together, and that's where they come up with the information that they put into this guidance document. Some things to keep in mind is that it's non-binding, so that means that it's not the actual language of the rule. And so you'll see as you're looking through the guidance and as we go through our webinar today, there'll be a lot of words like should or recommends, whereas in the produce safety rule, when you read it, it says must. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this. And then the guidance document is a little bit easier for FDA to modify, and so they've indicated that this document will be updated periodically as more information becomes available or as more research or comments from farmers that are taken into account. They've indicated that they will update this periodically. And so it's really important for farmers to review this guidance document. This is your opportunity to tell FDA your thoughts about the produce safety rule and any recommendations that are provided in that guidance document. So it's really a good resource for farmers to get some insight into what FDA is thinking about the produce safety rule. And comments that are received during this time that the guidance document is in its draft status will be taken into consideration and then eventually a final guidance document will come out from FDA. Next slide. So what's covered in the guidance document? The guidance document is set up in chapters, and the chapters align with the subparts of the rule. And so the chapters are listed here on the slide, and the ones that are in bold are the ones that we're going to cover today. Because we're only doing a 30-minute webinar, we're going to just stick to a couple of the chapters and just give you guys an idea of what is in the guidance document and how to look at the guidance document. So Chapter 1 is the general provisions, or subpart A. And Chapter 2 we're also going to cover, and that's personnel qualifications and the training overview, and that's subpart C. And then we're also going to go over Chapter 8, which is records, and that's subpart O. So the guidance document is really long, as many of you know who have gone and looked at it. It's about 190 pages. But FDA has provided summaries of each chapter, and they're available as at-a-glance documents. And so if you go to the website that was on the previous slide, there is on the right-hand side, there is an option to download those at-a-glance documents. And those are handy because it gives you an idea of what is covered in the chapter, but it doesn't go into all of the detail and doesn't provide all of the examples that FDA has indicated in the actual guidance document. So just keep that in mind as you look at those, that if you see something that you're like, wow, that seems like it might relate to my farm, then you can go to the actual guidance document and read what examples are provided there. Next slide. So then there are a few things that are not covered in the guidance document. Subpart Q, which is compliance and enforcement. Subpart R, which is the withdrawal of a qualified exemption. Subpart D, health and hygiene with respect to alternatives. And then subpart E, ag water, is also not covered. And I'm not sure how many of you saw a few weeks ago, FDA put out a notice that they have approved the extended compliance dates for the ag water subpart. And so those dates that we've been showing you as proposed dates, that has been finalized now. And so there is that additional 4 years for farmers to come into compliance with the water standards. But remember that FDA is reviewing all that, and likely the standards will change. And so they are taking this extended time to create those standards that are going to be flexible and achievable for farmers, while still balancing that aspect of public health. So the requirements under subpart E are not going to be enforced at this time. And then the other part that FDA is currently reviewing is the definition of a farm, and that is also not covered in the guidance. We still haven't gotten any further information on what changes will come to that definition. And as we go along, if you guys have questions, feel free to put them into the chat box and we can answer them as we go along, and definitely at the end as well. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just review our format for our discussion today so you guys can follow along. So if you go into the guidance document, in the beginning of the guidance document, the first several pages are the table of contents. And as you can see on this slide, it has Chapter 1, and then underneath the chapter there are sections, and they're numbered. So we kept those numbers on our slides as we go forward, just so you have a reference point to go into the guidance document then and look at it. Next slide. So the first chapter is, again, the general provisions, and this is subpart A. And so the things that are covered under the general provisions are the definition of produce, so what is considered produce, raw agricultural commodities, and in this part of the guidance document, it gives a lot of examples of what raw agricultural commodities are. So it provides examples of hydrocooling, refrigeration, removing of stems and leaves, and that includes activities that are designed to separate the commodity from foreign objects or other parts of the plant. And then it also gives examples of things that do not change the product from a rack. So that would be, that do change the product from a rack. So that would be chopping, cutting, cooking, any of those processing activities. So once you take your product and you change it in some way, then that would be a processing activity, and that changes it from that raw agricultural commodity. The guidance document in section 3 also talks about covered produce. So it gives a lot of examples of covered produce and then exempted produce. And the exempted produce includes those rarely consumed raw commodities, any produce that goes through commercial processing, or produce that is used for on-farm consumption. So it gives more detail and more examples about covered produce as well. And then it also talks about covered farms, so those farms that meet that $25,000 threshold. It also gives many examples on how to determine the produce sales for your farm, to determine what business size category you fall into, or if you do meet that $25,000 threshold. And then it also gives a lot of examples to help you figure out if you qualify for that modified exemption, so that part where there's that exemption for if you have less than $500,000 in total food sales and you sell to those directly to the consumer that are within Colorado or within 275 miles of your farm. So the guidance document really gives a lot of examples and a lot of information around how to calculate that and what sales to include in that total food sales. So it's I think that can be a really helpful part for some farmers who maybe have some questions around that. And then the final thing covered in Chapter 1 are the covered activities. So that's your growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities, and then the activities that are associated with those activities. So it gives a lot of detail around what activities are covered under the produce safety rule. And I just want to say, if you're reading through this part of the guidance document and you have questions about whether or not you're covered under the rule or whether or not you qualify for that modified exemption, please reach out to either myself or Martha, and we can help you work through that and figure out if you do meet those qualifications. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Martha, and she's going to talk about Chapter 2.
Great, thank you, Christy. So next we're going to dive into Chapter 2, which is Personnel Qualifications and Training Overview. And we're not going to cover the entire chapter, but we did want to give you an idea of some of the examples that are in this chapter. And it's a really important one because we know that workers can introduce contamination while handling produce or food contact surfaces. And so this chapter will really help us understand some of these examples about assigned duties, qualifications, and other aspects of training. So we'll go through those 1 through 6 that are bolded in just a little bit more detail. So the first section that we're going to look at is evaluating personnel's assigned duties. And so the guidance is really helpful here in helping us to think about all of those workers, all of the personnel who handle or supervise the handling of covered produce. And so we'll find, for example, the guidance mentions full-time, permanent, temporary, part-time, seasonal, contracted, as well as other relevant personnel. And so that helps us think a little bit more expansively about who needs to be trained. And then it tells us to look at those at that personnel, at their duties, and it provides some good examples of where covered produce might be handled, as well as where covered produce would not be handled. So as you're doing that review and observation of duties, it provides you with some examples. And examples of where covered produce are handled are, for example, harvesting by hand, sorting, grading, and packing, handling food contact surfaces of containers, also cleaning and maintaining harvesting and packing equipment. And so you can see those examples on the slide. Also mentioned some examples of where covered produce is not handled. And so a few examples are removing trash, sweeping floors, maintaining restrooms, pest control. So, helps you narrow your focus in terms of where those personnel are who are handling covered produce. Then the guidance also mentions that even if it is an infrequent duty that staff might handle covered produce or those food contact surfaces or supervise someone who is, then they do need that training. And that training is a combination of education, training, and experience that's necessary to perform their duties in a manner that ensures compliance with produce safety rules. So that, I think the guidance makes it a little clearer for us that it's, they're assigned duties as well as maybe any infrequent duties. Then the next section is the qualifications necessary to perform assigned duties, so section number 2. So we know that workers need that education, training, and experience, but then the guidance provides us with some examples of the types of knowledge that they might need. And so you can see this list of examples on your screen. And they provide the example that if a worker is packing covered produce by hand, then some things they may need to know about are any health conditions that could contaminate covered produce, so communicable diseases or other types of conditions, any personal cleanliness, hygiene that's relevant for their assigned duties, avoiding contact with animals except for working animals, and so forth. So this just provides you with additional examples, and you can think about these in the context of your own farm and see what other areas workers might be handling covered produce that you would need to provide them with that training. Then the guidance also makes it clear that if the duties of those workers change, they may need additional training. So, for example, if you hire workers and they are initially brought on for planting and field work, but then later they're assigned to the harvest crew, if you feel like their initial training did not adequately cover the harvesting duties that they were later assigned, then you might determine that they'd need additional training because your initial training didn't cover their new duties. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And then the guidance also provides some additional information on supervisors who need that food safety and hygiene knowledge and training, and the types of occasions where they might need that. And so that might be, for example, they would need to determine that the workers who are coming every day, the harvest crew, for example, do they have any kind of applicable health condition that might lead to contamination of covered produce? So they would need to be able to recognize symptoms of concern, know what to do with workers who might present those symptoms or conditions, and then be able to do something about it. So are they able to take action that they need to do as a supervisor? So that might be sending the worker home, reassigning them. So again, just making sure that supervisors have that knowledge and training also. The next section then, section 3, refers to training frequency. And so the rule tells us that personnel that you identify who handle covered produce or food contact surfaces, or those who supervise the individuals who do that, they need to receive adequate training. And this is very specific upon hiring, periodically thereafter, or at least once annually, and then as necessary and appropriate in light of observations or any other information that might indicate that those staff are not meeting the standards of the produce safety rule. So the guidance provides us with a little bit more information on how timing and frequency may change for your operation. And so they provide some examples about timing. So for example, if you bring on a worker in December who is doing mainly clerical work and then moves to handling covered produce in harvesting, say in May, you may defer the training that's specific to harvesting until April. So it's really applicable to the duties that that person will actually be doing. If you have year-round production, you may be doing training several times a year to different harvest groups, to different pack crews. The guidance also mentions that you might want to deliver training in smaller groups to emphasize, and that could be based on language differences or learning styles. And you may also feel like, based on your own observations or records, that you need to do refresher courses more frequently. So that would be another reason to your frequency of training may look different than that which is stated in the rule initially. The guidance provides you with a little bit more information. And then lastly, the guidance gives us some examples of how you would want to keep your training up to date, because that's really important. So, you know, looking to other sources of information, so information research coming out of academic institutions, extension, information from industry associations, government agencies. You know, if there's a new outbreak taking practices or causality that we learn from that outbreak, to understand how that might influence our practices as we learn. So just a little bit more information on keeping training up to date. The next section 4 refers to easily understandable training for personnel. And so the guidance reminds us that training has to be easily understood, and then provides some ideas on how to accomplish this. And so that includes, you know, using examples that are relevant to practices and procedures on your farm, and making sure that personnel are trained at or near their work areas. And so if they're working on, if you're teaching cleaning and sanitizing, that they're using the exact materials and solutions in the location near where they would be doing cleaning and sanitizing, so it really is more relevant to them. Using examples such as when you observe that someone has not followed a procedure, using that as an opportunity to show everyone, you know, this is what our exact procedure is. And then the guidance refers to hands-on practice and demonstration using visual aids and just other ways that you can support different learning styles and make sure that your training is understood by a range of workers who might be employed on your farm. Section 5 talks about minimum training requirements and refers to 3 areas. And so those are food hygiene and food safety, health and personal hygiene, and then meeting the standards in subparts C through O of the produce safety rule. And so this talks about how you really need to focus on those principles that will help your personnel understand how to perform their duties in a way that aligns with the requirements of the produce safety rule, understanding those underlying principles of food hygiene, safety, health, and personal hygiene. And in this section, then, the guidance provides some really good examples of how you might put this into action. And so they provide a situation, for example, you are training personnel who are assigned, someone who's assigned to remove trash from a packing area, but just explaining to that person that, you know, on the way to removing that trash, they may inadvertently, through where they walk or how they remove the trash, they could contaminate some area of that packing or holding area. And so just making sure that staff understand both how their actions influence produce safety and, you know, around them as well. And then an example from the guidance is also looking at personnel who might be cleaning and sanitizing packing equipment. So information that you would want to train them on are all the elements of subpart L. So cleaning and sanitizing equipment, so procedures that are relevant and used on your farm, as well as any solutions that you use, as well as how that person's actions might lead to contamination and cross-contamination of covered produce. So I think we'll look at the next section then, section 6, looks at then an important area, additional training for those who conduct harvest activities. And so the guidance provides some examples of observations that it would be important for personnel to make and to recognize when they should not be harvesting covered produce. And so some of those observations are finding, for example, animal feces, bite marks, crop destruction, anything that would indicate to them that covered produce should not be harvested. And if they found those indications either before or during harvest, that it would be important to know not to harvest that covered produce. The guidance points out that this applies to all personnel, including contracted, part-time, and temporary personnel that you might bring in for harvesting. And so you would either provide this training, or you would make sure that, for example, if you're using a contract service, that they provided that training. And that training also extends to recognizing that harvest containers and equipment are in good condition, in suitable condition, and provide some examples of ways that you might convey that information. So using actual harvest containers that are damaged and showing that these are not appropriate for use during harvest, using pictures to illustrate the same thing, or maybe showing pictures of workers who are handling a harvest container and they've got an injury or a wound that might contaminate the container or covered produce, or stepping on that container. So again, provide some specific examples that can help you better convey that information to personnel working on harvest. And then Christy, I will pass it to you for Chapter 8.
Okay, Chapter 8 focuses on records, and the main part of Chapter 8 really talks about the general requirements for records. So that's record storage, the option to use existing records that you use for other programs, how long do you need to keep them, what format can they be in, they can be in electronic or paper, records disclosures, and then any specific records requirements are handled in each of the chapters. So if you go into the draft guidance, chapters 1, 2, 4, and 7 all have more specific information on the records required in those chapters. So that'll be helpful for everybody as well going forward. So how can farmers comment? So there's a couple options. You can go to the first website, which is www.regulations.gov, and you can enter the docket number into that, and it's a search box and it brings it up for you. Or you can use the second link provided there, and it'll take you right into the place where you can comment. And so those are the online options. You can also submit written comments to the address that's provided in Rockville, Maryland. And again, identify that comment with that docket number that's provided there. And so the thing to keep in mind is that they're only taking comments until April 22nd. So it's really important for farmers to provide the information, and FDA is really seeking feedback from farmers on this guidance document, and they're looking for specific and real examples that pertain to your farm. And it'd be really helpful for you to reference the specific part of the rule that you're actually commenting on, as opposed to submitting a general comment. It's important for you to say it applies to the biological soil amendments, and then the part that is actually under the biological amendments that you're commenting to, would be important for you to include that. And just one final plug for you guys is that this is your opportunity to communicate your thoughts to FDA about the produce safety rule, and then provide any solutions that you may have. Maybe you have a really good idea for how to handle something under the produce safety rule, and they're looking for that information as well. Next slide. Here's the website again for you if you want to go find more information about the guidance. So it includes that draft guidance PDF document that we showed a picture of in the beginning. It provides a link to that Federal Register notice. You can find those at-a-glance overviews, so those quick reference documents for the guidance. And then it also has links to the produce safety rule. So that's our final talk about the guidance document. I hope this was helpful. We do have 2 upcoming webinars coming up. They are April 25th, and we're going to talk about on-farm readiness reviews, and then May 15th, we're going to talk about produce safety rule inspections. And all of that information can be found several places on our website, so coproducesafety.org, or through the CDA newsletter or the CFEGA newsletter. You can log in as you did today. There's not a registration required, so we would love to have you join us. I know we're at the end of our time. Does anybody have any questions or need any more information?
Christy, this is Robert.
Hi, Robert.
Of the 152 pages of the guidance document, I have to admit I haven't read through them all yet. And now that I'm planting, I don't know whether I will be able to by the April deadline. Is there a specific area that you suggest that we focus in on that you think would be beneficial for us to provide comments on?
I can give my thoughts, and then Martha can give her thoughts separately. So I wouldn't say that there's maybe a specific area. I think it would be helpful for you to think, where are you most concerned about the produce safety rule as it relates to your farm? And then go, just look at that part of the guidance document and see if, your concern is addressed in there, or as you read through it, if you feel comfortable what's provided in there, and if not, then provide a comment back to that. I don't necessarily think that I have a specific suggestion for something you should comment on. Martha, did you have other thoughts?
No, I think that's a really good way to look at it, just because there may be some examples that are provided that don't seem like they would be relevant to your farm, and so making sure that you feel like when you are applying the produce safety rule that you can find examples that support your practices. I think that would be the way to go through the guidance.
Okay, thanks.
Great question, Robert.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, hearing none, we will turn you guys loose. I'm sorry we ran a couple minutes late due to our technical difficulties in the beginning, but we appreciate you all getting on. And if you think of anything or have any questions in the future, please just reach out to myself, Martha, or Danielle here at the Department of Agriculture, and we'll be more than willing to answer any questions or help you out with anything you need.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.